I stood in the drugstore clutching the prescription as if it were the last thread holding my world together. My wife had been in pain for weeks, and the doctor had promised her this medicine would bring her relief. The bright overhead lights hummed coldly, reflecting off the polished counters and glass shelves as I shifted from foot to foot on my aching knees, waiting for the woman behind the counter to notice me. I told her what I needed, trying to keep my voice even. She punched a few keys on the computer, then shook her head in a shrill tone. "We don't have that." I opened my mouth to protest, to explain that the doctor himself had called ahead to this very drugstore, that it was the only one that had everything my wife needed. But she was already turning away, taking another customer's order, as if my presence had already been erased from her memory. I had stood in lines like this before, felt the pain of being ignored, but this time it was different. This was about my wife, about her dignity, about my promise to take care of her no matter what. And then I saw him, a white man in a long, tailored coat that looked like it cost more than a month's pension. He walked in with his head held high, handed over a prescription with a confident smile, and moments later, the same pharmacist who had told me, "We don't have that for you," handed him the same medicine across the counter. I stood there, gritting my teeth, watching it all unfold in slow motion. His bag rustled as she put the bottle away, her voice suddenly soft and polite, as if it were something important to me. I spent most of my life inside a factory. The air was thick with oil and dust, and the machines never really stopped screaming. My hands carried the marks of that work, burns, scars, calluses that never faded. I didn't complain back then. I believed if I worked hard, kept my head down, my family would be safe. That's what I told myself when the long shifts stretched into nights, when my back ached so bad I couldn't stand up straight at the dinner table. For decades, the factory was my world. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. It bought school clothes for my kids, kept food on the table, and gave me just enough to believe we'd be all right. Then the plant shut down, piece by piece. They said the market had changed, that they needed to cut costs. Men like me, older, black, not college-educated, were the first to go. One day I had a job. The next, I was standing in the unemployment line with nothing but a folder of papers that didn't mean much to anyone but me. Time did its work on me, too. My knees stiffened, my lungs got weaker, and the years of lifting, bending, breathing, and smoke left me worn down. My wife's health fell apart even faster than mine. She had worked in a diner for decades, breathing grease and staying on her feet until her ankles swelled. Now she can barely move some mornings. I tell myself that getting her medicine, keeping her comfortable, is the only fight I've got left. But the truth is, it feels like I became invisible the moment I stopped punching a clock. Nobody asks what I gave to this city, to this country. Nobody cares that I paid my taxes, raised decent kids, kept out of trouble. When I walk into places now, I see the way people's eyes slide past me, like I'm just background, like I don't matter. That's why that prescription meant more than just pills. It was proof that I could still do something, still bring something home that mattered. I wasn't walking into that pharmacy just as an old man. I was walking in as a husband who refused to quit on his wife. The day I walked into that pharmacy, the air felt colder than it should have. Outside, it was late afternoon, traffic moving slow, the kind of gray sky that presses down on you. But inside, everything was bright and sharp. White tiles on the floor, lights buzzing overhead, shelves lined in perfect rows of bottles and boxes. It smelled like bleach and plastic, too clean, almost fake. I clutched the prescription in my hand like it might slip away if I didn't hold tight enough. My wife was at home, lying in bed, waiting. I'd promised her I'd bring back the medicine, that it would ease the pain that had been keeping her up all night. I told myself this was just routine. Doctor writes the order, pharmacy fills it, and I carry it home. Nothing more to it. Still, my chest felt tight as I walked toward the counter. The woman behind the counter barely looked at me. She was young, maybe late 20s, hair tied back neat, glasses resting on the bridge of her nose. Her voice was flat when she said, "Can I help you?" I slid the paper across, careful, polite. She scanned it, glanced up at me, then back down. Her eyes lingered on my jacket. It was old, patched at the elbow, and for a second, I swear, I saw her mouth tighten. When she spoke again, her tone had changed. "We don't have that in stock," she said, quick, like she was done with me already. My stomach dropped. I asked if she could check again, that my doctor had told me this pharmacy kept it. She didn't move from her spot. "It's not here," she said, this time sharper, her eyes sliding past me to the next person in line. In that moment, I felt something shift. It wasn't just about medicine anymore. It was about the way she looked through me, like I wasn't even worth the time it took to double-check a shelf. My hand tightened around the edge of the counter. I wanted to believe it was a mistake, a mix-up, something simple, but deep down, I already knew better. I stood there trying to steady my breath and told her again what my doctor had said. I explained that he had checked, that this pharmacy carried the medicine. My voice cracked, but I kept it low, respectful. She didn't care. She didn't even touch the keyboard to check her system. She just shook her head slightly, eyes narrowed, like I was wasting her time. I leaned in closer, not to threaten, but to be heard. I said my wife was at home, that she was in pain, and that I just needed the prescription filled. Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Sir, I told you it's not available. Next in line, please." That last part stung more than the refusal. She spoke it loud enough for everyone around to hear, like I was some nuisance holding up the day. Then he walked in. A white man, maybe my son's age, but dressed sharp. Wool coat, leather gloves, a watch that caught the light when he adjusted his sleeve. He walked right up, dropped his slip of paper on the counter, and asked for the same medicine I had begged for. I heard it clear, the same name, the same dosage. Her face changed instantly. She smiled, leaned forward, even made small talk while typing into the computer she never touched for me. A few clicks later, she opened the cabinet behind her and pulled the bottle out like it had been waiting there the whole time. She set it gently in a white paper bag, folded it twice, and handed it over like she was serving him at a fine restaurant. I felt my chest tighten, my ears ringing. It wasn't just the medicine. It was the ease of it, the way the wall she built with me turned into a door for him. My fingers curled around the prescription in my pocket, crumpling it. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything but the rush of blood in my head. All I could think about was the nights I worked double shifts, the taxes I paid, the years I gave to its system that now pretended I didn't exist. To watch that pill bottle slide into his hand so effortlessly, while my wife lay at home waiting, felt like someone had spit right in my face. I didn't move at first. My legs felt like they were planted in the tile, heavy as concrete. People behind me shifted, restless, waiting for me to step aside. I could feel their eyes on my back, the quiet pressure telling me to give up, to let it go. For a second, I almost did. My throat was tight, my pride stung raw, and the easiest thing would have been to turn around, walk out, and carry my shame home in silence. But then I pictured her, my wife lying in bed, one hand pressed to her side, eyes clouded with pain. I thought about the promise I had made before leaving the house, how I told her I'd bring back what she needed. That promise pulled me upright. My heart was pounding, but I knew I couldn't just disappear, not this time. I cleared my throat and asked again, louder this time, so the room could hear me. I said my doctor had confirmed the medicine was here, that it was urgent, that I needed her to look again. My voice wasn't shaky anymore. It was sharp, like steel cutting through the hum of the pharmacy. She glanced at me with irritation, the kind you save for a child who won't stop asking the same question. "Sir, I already told you. We don't have it." Her hand moved to the side, waving the next person forward. It was the dismissal, more than the refusal, that lit the fire in me. I wasn't just being denied medicine. I was being erased, pushed aside like I didn't belong. I straightened my shoulders and stayed where I was. My hand went into my pocket, pulled out a small notebook I carried for bills and doctor notes. I clicked my pen and started writing. Her name tag, the time on the wall clock, the words she had said. My handwriting was jagged, but I made sure it was clear. The line grew quiet. I caught the young trainee at the next register watching me. He was pale, nervous, his eyes darting between me and the pharmacist. For a moment, our eyes met. He looked away fast, but I saw something there. Guilt, maybe even shame. He knew what was happening, but he kept his mouth shut. I understood why. A paycheck can hold your tongue tighter than any chain. I wrote slowly, making each detail permanent on the page. I wanted her to see that I wasn't leaving empty-handed. She leaned over the counter, her voice hushed but sharp. "Sir, you're making a scene." I looked her dead in the eye and said, "No, ma'am. You already made it. I'm just not letting it vanish." The words surprised even me. They weren't loud, but they carried weight. My hands were still shaking, but now it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline. I tucked the notebook back in my coat and folded the prescription carefully, not like trash, but like evidence. I knew I couldn't win standing there, not against her, not against the system that let her act this way, but I could refuse to walk out silent. I could refuse to let her pretend it never happened. That thought steadied me, gave me enough strength to turn away with my head high instead of bowed. Walking to the door, I felt the eyes of the customers following me. Some looked away quick, others just stared. None of them spoke. My shoes echoed on the tile, each step a reminder that I was choosing to fight in the only way I still could, by remembering, by recording, by refusing to vanish. And as I pushed the glass door open, cold air rushing in, I made a promise to myself, this wouldn't end here. I walked home from that pharmacy with empty hands, but my mind didn't rest. Each step felt heavy, like I was carrying more than just my body. I carried the shame, the anger, the image of that man in his fine coat walking out with the very thing I had begged for. By the time I reached my front porch, the weight of it all had settled deep inside me. My wife was waiting in her chair near the window, a blanket pulled tight around her shoulders. She looked up, eyes tired but hopeful. When she saw my hands empty, that hope flickered and faded. I couldn't even meet her gaze at first. I told her the truth. I said they refused, that they gave it to someone else right in front of me. Her lips pressed together, and she nodded slowly, like she had expected it. That quiet acceptance cut me worse than the refusal itself. I sat across from her and pulled out the notebook. I read her the words I had written, the name tag, the exact sentence, the time. I told her I wasn't letting this slip into silence. She touched my arm lightly and whispered, "You do what you have to do." That was all the permission I needed. The next morning, I went back to my doctor's office. I laid the prescription on the counter and told the nurse what happened. She frowned, whispered something about supply issues, but her eyes gave her away. She knew it wasn't about medicine. She promised to mention it to the doctor, but I could tell it wouldn't go far. I thanked her anyway, left, and sat outside in my car with my notebook open on my lap. That's when I thought of my church. It wasn't just a place of worship, it was where people still listened. That Sunday, after service, I stood up in the fellowship hall. My voice shook at first, but then the words rolled out steady. I told them how I had been turned away, how the pharmacist smiled at another man while telling me nothing was available. Faces around me hardened, jaws tightened. Some nodded because they'd seen their own versions of this story. Others looked down, too familiar with the silence that usually followed. But one woman, a deacon's wife, raised her hand. She said she'd been at that same pharmacy last month and was told something similar. She walked out empty-handed, but later, her neighbor, a white woman, had picked up the same prescription without a problem. The room went quiet. My story wasn't alone anymore. It was part of a pattern. That week, I wrote a letter to the local newspaper. I didn't dress it up fancy. I just laid it bare. What happened, the exact words, how it felt. I mailed it off, not sure if it would ever see print. 2 weeks later, it did. My name was there, in black and white. My words stretched across the community section. For the first time in years, people stopped me on the street, not to look through me, but to look at me. Some patted my shoulder. Some just whispered, "I read what you wrote." Then something I didn't expect happened. The young trainee from the pharmacy showed up at my porch one evening. He stood there with his hat in his hands, eyes down, shifting from foot to foot. He said he remembered me, that he saw what happened, that he wanted to apologize for staying quiet. He told me it wasn't the first time. He'd watched the pharmacist turn people away before, always the same kind of people. Older, black, poor. He admitted he was scared of losing his job if he spoke up. I told him I understood fear, but silence has its own cost. He nodded, eyes wet, and said he was ready to tell the truth if anyone asked. That small act, just his willingness to stand by the truth, felt like the first crack in the wall. Word spread faster than I thought it could. A neighbor stopped by to say she'd had trouble at the same counter. Another man at the barber shop said his father was turned away months ago. Each story was like another stone added to the pile. What had started as my pain was beginning to show as something larger. The local paper called me back, asking if they could do a follow-up. This time they wanted to put my picture in, to call it by its name, discrimination. I sat for the interview, hands folded, voice calm but steady. I wasn't trying to make myself into anything more than what I was, a man who wanted medicine for his wife. But I wasn't about to pretend it was only about me either. When the second article ran, the pharmacy could no longer hide in silence. People started whispering about it in town, then speaking louder. The church organized a meeting, and folks showed up with their own notes, their own receipts, their own quiet testimonies. It wasn't just me against a counter clerk anymore. It was a community pointing to something that had been brushed aside too long. I knew the fight had only begun, but in that moment, I felt something I hadn't in years: dignity. Not because the system had changed, not because I had won anything yet, but because I refused to be erased. My empty prescription wasn't just paper anymore. It had become proof, and proof had power. The week after the article came out, I couldn't walk through town without feeling the weight of eyes on me. Some looks carried sympathy, some curiosity, and some were filled with a kind of quiet anger that wasn't meant for me but for what had happened. People nodded at me, strangers even, like I had spoken something they'd been holding in their chests for years. A few days later, I got a letter in the mail with the pharmacy's logo stamped in the corner. My hand shook as I opened it. Inside was a typed apology, signed by the store's owner. He said he was deeply concerned about my experience, and that measures would be taken to ensure it didn't happen again. The words felt polished, distant, not real. It wasn't for me, it was for their reputation. Still, I took that letter and pinned it to the wall by our kitchen table. My wife stared at it for a long time before saying softly, "They're afraid now." That was the first time I'd heard hope in her voice in months. The real shift came when an inspector from the state showed up. A neighbor told me she'd seen him in the pharmacy with a clipboard, talking to the staff, checking the shelves. A week later, a second inspector followed. For once, it wasn't me standing alone at the counter, begging to be seen. Now the spotlight was on them. The pharmacist who had dismissed me tried to soften her image. People said she greeted customers with forced smiles, her tone sweeter than sugar. But for many, it was too late. The truth had already spread. Folks started going to different pharmacies, refusing to give their business to a place that treated some customers like second-class citizens. Not long after, a reporter knocked on my door. She was from a larger paper, one that reached beyond our small town. She asked me to tell the story again, this time for a wider audience. I sat in my living room, notebook in hand, repeating the details that had burned themselves into my memory. The lights, the words, the way the bottle slid into another man's hand. She listened quietly, writing everything down, her pen moving fast. When the article ran, the story wasn't just local anymore. It was statewide. That's when the pharmacy owner called me. His voice was stiff, but there was a tremor underneath. He asked if I would meet him in person. I agreed, not because I wanted anything from him, but because I wanted him to see me as a man, face to face, without the glass encounter between us. We met in his office behind the pharmacy. He was an older man, gray hair slicked back, suit pressed neat. He started with the same words from the letter: apologies, promises, regret. I let him finish, then I leaned forward. I told him this wasn't just about one bottle of medicine. It was about the years of work men like me had given to this town, the taxes we'd paid, the service we had done, only to be pushed aside in our old age. He shifted in his chair, uncomfortable, but I didn't stop. I told him my wife's pain wasn't a statistic. I told him what it felt like to stand invisible, while someone else, with lighter skin and a heavier wallet, walked out with the very thing I was denied. He didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, the silence in that office was louder than his apology. A week later, I heard the pharmacist was gone. They said she had stepped down, but everyone knew she was pushed out. Another face took her place, someone younger, but with a different attitude. The first time I saw her, she looked me in the eye, spoke with respect, and treated me like a customer who mattered. It wasn't redemption, but it was something. The pressure didn't stop there. Community leaders began holding meetings about healthcare access. My church hosted one, and people filled every chair. Stories poured out about being ignored, about being dismissed, about being charged more for the same prescriptions. It wasn't just about one pharmacy anymore. It was about a system that had built quiet walls where doors should have been. I didn't plan on becoming a voice in those meetings, but every time I tried to sit back, someone asked me to speak. So I did. I told them how silence eats at you, how it makes you smaller, how it convinces you that you don't matter. And I told them how writing that notebook in the pharmacy, refusing to walk out empty, gave me back a piece of myself. Soon, people weren't just telling stories. They were organizing. A petition went around demanding better oversight of pharmacies in our county. More than 1,000 signatures stacked up in just a few weeks. Folks called state offices, demanding action. The small crack I had made by speaking out widened into something bigger, something stronger than me alone. Then came the day I walked into the pharmacy and actually left with my wife's medicine in hand. The bag was light, but in my chest, it felt heavy with meaning. When I handed it to her at home, she held it close like it was more than just pills. It was proof we hadn't been beaten down completely. She whispered, "You did it." But I shook my head. We did it. All of us. The battle wasn't over. I still saw the same looks in certain places, the lingering stares, the dismissive tones. But now I knew I wasn't alone in it. I had neighbors, church members, even strangers who had read my words and decided to add their own. My story had become a mirror, and once people looked into it, they couldn't pretend not to see what was staring back. Justice didn't come as a grand victory. There was no parade, no sudden shift in the world. It came in small steps. The inspector's clipboard, the owner's nervous voice, the pharmacist's removal, the new respect at the counter. It came in the gathering of voices refusing to be silenced anymore. And maybe most of all, it came in my own home, where my wife smiled through her pain as she swallowed the medicine we had fought for. That moment, quiet and ordinary, carried more weight than any apology or headline, because for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had brought something home that truly mattered. I never thought of myself as someone people looked to. For most of my life, I was the one keeping my head down, just trying to get through the day. But after the pharmacy, things changed. It wasn't overnight, but slowly, folks started coming to me with their own stories. Some told me in whispers outside the church. Others called my house in the evenings. They weren't asking for answers. They just wanted someone to listen, someone who wouldn't brush them off like they didn't matter. I listened, and I wrote things down in the same notebook I carried that day. I filled page after page with names, dates, and the words people couldn't forget. A woman told me how her father sat in a waiting room for hours while others were seen ahead of him. A young man said the pharmacy raised the price of his medicine after seeing the insurance card he carried. Each story had its own details, but the feeling underneath was always the same: shame, anger, the sense of being invisible. The first time someone asked me to stand with them, I almost said no. A neighbor's daughter wanted me to go with her to pick up her mother's prescription because she was scared of being treated the way I had been. I hesitated. I didn't want to live in that place again. But then I remembered the promise I had made to myself the night I left that pharmacy. I told her yes. We went together. She handed over the paper, and I stood a step behind her, watching closely. The pharmacist, a new face, handled it with respect. The medicine was handed over without a problem. My neighbor turned to me afterward, eyes wide, and whispered, "Maybe they're different when someone's watching." That cut deep, but it was true. Sometimes just being there, standing beside someone, changed the way the world treated them. Word spread that I would go with people if they asked. It wasn't anything official, no title, no role. I just showed up. I stood in lines, sat in waiting rooms, leaned on counters. I didn't raise my voice unless I had to. Most times, my presence alone was enough. Other times, I wrote things down just like before, making sure nobody could erase the truth. At home, my wife kept getting sicker, but she also seemed lighter. She told me she felt proud again, proud of me, proud that I wasn't just carrying pain but turning it into something useful. On her better days, she encouraged me to keep going, even when I was tired. On her worst days, I sat by her side and read the stories people had trusted me with. She would shake her head slowly and whisper, "It's everywhere, isn't it?" I'd nod and say, "Yes, but now it's out in the open." The newspaper called again months later, asking to follow up on what had happened since my first letter. I agreed, but only if they printed some of the other voices too. When the article ran, it wasn't just my picture anymore. It was a collection of faces. Neighbors, church members, even that young trainee from the pharmacy. The headline talked about change, but I didn't see it as change yet. I saw it as a beginning. Some nights I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about the past. All those years on the factory floor, all the sweat and pain, all the silence I carried. I realized how much of my life I had spent swallowing words, convincing myself it was better to stay quiet. Now I understood the cost of that silence. It eats at you. It makes you smaller, until one day someone looks through you like you're not there. That's the part I wanted people to understand. I wasn't trying to be a leader. I was just trying not to vanish. But the more I spoke, the more people saw themselves in my story. And the more they shared, the less alone I felt. That was the real medicine. Hearing each other, standing together, refusing to let the system decide who was worthy and who was not. In time, the meetings grew larger. Community centers filled with people who once would have stayed home. Some brought notes, others just came to listen. I sat in the back most nights, letting others take the floor. But when they called my name, I stood up and told the same story I told 100 times. The pharmacy, the refusal, the notebook. Every time I told it, the pain came back, sharp and clear. But every time I told it, the shame grew smaller, and the dignity grew stronger. My wife passed her hardest nights with me sitting by her bed, holding her hand. Sometimes she would smile faintly and say, "I'm glad you didn't let them break you." I'd squeeze her hand and whisper, "We didn't let them. Not me alone." Looking back, I know the battle isn't over. The faces change, the rules shift, but the weight of prejudice is still here. Still, I believe something cracked open that day at the pharmacy, something that can't be sealed shut again. Because once people see injustice clearly, it's harder to pretend it doesn't exist. When I think about the life I've lived, I don't see victories or headlines. I see ordinary moments, hands on a counter, voices in a church hall, a bag of medicine finally placed in the right hands. I see a community that found its voice, even if it trembled at first. And I see myself, an old man who once felt invisible, standing tall enough to be seen. The real sickness wasn't in my wife's body, or even in mine. It was in the way people let themselves look past others, dismiss them, deny them. That sickness doesn't heal with pills. It heals with truth, with courage, with people willing to stand together. I didn't find that out in a book or a sermon. I found it out at a pharmacy counter, empty-handed, humiliated, and then stubborn enough to refuse to stay silent. And though I never wanted this fight, I carry it now. Because if I can help even one more person walk away with dignity instead of shame, then maybe I've finally done something that matters. Thank you for staying with me through this story. I know it wasn't easy to hear because it wasn't easy to live, but I believe every voice matters, even when it shakes. Sharing this part of my life was my way of making sure silence doesn't win again. Now I want to turn to you. Have you ever felt invisible when you needed help the most? Have you ever been treated differently because of the way you look, the way you speak, or the place you come from? And if you did, what did you do with that moment? Did you walk away? or did you find the strength to speak? I'd like to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment, share your own story, or simply tell me what you felt while listening. Every story we share is another piece of truth added to the whole picture. And truth is the first step toward change.